You're listening to the Decisive podcast, insights and analysis to empower confident decision-making. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Decisive podcast. I'm your host, Kristen Hallam. In this episode, we'll be discussing zombie ships and other deceptive shipping tactics as outlined in our latest Maritime State of Play report. Here to share some top takeaways from the report is Jeremy Domballe, Product Director, Maritime Intelligence and Risk. Jeremy, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, can you provide an overview of the key deceptive shipping practices highlighted in the Maritime State of Play report? What are the most concerning trends?
There's quite a few in there, and it really is a game of cat and mouse that seems to evolve year on year. As the mouse finds new ways to get to the cheese, there's bigger mouse traps which are being developed, and then they find new ways to get to the cheese, so to speak. There's a variety of different sort of tactics, from complexities in the entity structures associated to vessels, in terms of to the alteration of vessel identifiers, be it digital, physical, or registered identifiers, or even committing fraud from a false flag perspective, and other falsifications of documentation, even transshipment of cargo through whitewashing, so passing the cargo along a chain to different vessels to make the origin a little bit more obscured. So it is really complex environment with these various tactics, not always used in isolation, often used in tandem with one another, just to further complicate and convolute the operational subterfuge being carried out.
And how have technological advancements contributed to the rise of deceptive shipping tactics? Are there specific technologies that are being manipulated here?
One of the technologies that's relied on from a maritime perspective is AIS, an automatic identification system. And it's a broadcasting system that allows for the positional monitoring of vessels. It was never really designed for that. It was designed as primarily an anti-collision system, but it's grown legs and over the years been used as a means to actively track ships globally. But as with many technologies, there are vulnerabilities, especially old technologies. So in this case, either the positions associated to the target can be manipulated, or the actual identifiers of the vessel can be manipulated. So you can give the impression that you are digitally in one place, when in fact, physically, you're somewhere else. So it's the magician's trick of misdirection there. Or you can take another approach whereby, rather than identify as your legitimate identity, you can adopt that of either a historical one that you had, or one of another vessel that's perhaps no longer actively operating on the seas. So it's more of, not necessarily technology is changing, but the creativeness of some of these bad actors is improving, finding more innovative ways to evade scrutiny, so to speak.
You described taking on the identity of a vessel that's no longer on the seas. Is that what one would call a zombie ship?
It would be, yes. So the dead coming back to life, so to speak. So it would be the adoption of those identifiers, be it the name, the IMO number, or even the radio details associated to them. So call signs, even dimensions, and the MMSI associated to that vessel. When we talk about sort of identity in itself, there's sort of three facets of data that come into play. You have your digital footprint, so that's how you're perceived through the digisphere, if you will. There's your physical identifiers, and that's how the tangible elements, so to speak, you can touch, you can physically see. And then there's your registered footprint, or your registered identifiers, and that's how you're documented on paper. And in the perfect world, all of those three ought to coalesce in the same way they do for us, as you might appear on social media, as you might appear through your passports, and how you are yourself as a person physically seen. So those ought to coalesce. But if you start to manipulate one of those, suddenly it changes that dynamic. So if the digital identifiers no longer coalesce to that of your physical or your registered identifiers, it becomes a lot harder to actually validate that you are who you say you are and you are where you say you are. And that's part of this deception. particularly for zombie ships.
Very interesting. So, Jeremy, how do geopolitical tensions influence deceptive shipping practices? Are there specific regions that are more affected than others?
A lot of this is very closely tied to geopolitical tensions. So when we talk about deceptive shipping in this case, it's often tied to the dark fleet, the grey fleet, the ghost fleet, however you wish to describe it. These are vessels associated in trades or trade activity that is under sanctions or restrictions. And that in itself is usually as a result of geopolitical tensions in the first place, be it Iranian oil, be it Russian oil, Venezuelan oil. There are restrictions in place in those regimes to how that's globally traded. But it goes beyond that sometimes, even to looking at other types of cargoes or even looking at other segments of vessels. So when we talk about deceptive shipping, it can also touch upon illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, for instance, and how those illegal catches might move as a result of some of that deception. So, yes, the two are intrinsically tied, and as those tensions grow, so does typically the sort of the response, and as a result, also the manner in which these bad actors attempt to skirt and circumvent sanctions. And we see that today from a sanctions perspective, we're hitting all-time highs. There has not been, in the last however many years, more vessels subject to sanctions, either directly through government agencies or indirectly through associated parties, with the US, the EU, and the UK spearheading those initiatives and driving that pressure.
So, not only are the bad actors getting more creative about circumventing sanctions, there's also more vessels to keep track of for compliance officers. Is that right?
Definitely, yes. And this, as with many things, it's a risk benefits situations. As long as the benefits outweigh the associated risk to conduct these operations, people will find a way. People will find a way to make it happen, either through very simple deception or more sophisticated levels of deception. But it ultimately comes down to the financial benefits of undertaking that risk.
Mm, very sobering. Very sobering. So let's talk about some of the case studies in the report. The report does include several case studies. Could you discuss maybe one of them to illustrate some of the complexities of these deceptive practices for our listeners?
Certainly. So we touched base on 4 different types of case studies as part of the report, and some of them do have common elements bringing them together, mainly the areas of operation. The more interesting one, in my personal view, is that of zombie vessels, the adoption of historical identities associated to dead ships and recycled vessels coming back to life. And it's part of that sort of identity manipulation where the digital identity falls out of canter, and it becomes a lot harder to tie into other identifiers you might have on record. So they will literally assume a variety of different parameters associated to those dead ships: the name, the MMSI, the call sign, the dimensions. And unless you have a form of actually checking to see if that vessel is still in circulation, it is incredibly convincing. The areas in which they operate is also a little bit of a tell. So we see quite a lot maneuvering between sort of the Caribbean and the Persian Gulf towards Malaysian waters, and from Malaysia between the Eastern Asia and back down to carry out transits. So it ties into, so again, those geopolitical tensions taking place in Venezuela and the regime there, but also within the Middle East with Iran and the oil trade coming out of there too. And there's quite a lot of targets. In the study itself, we were looking at 40 different targets coming through. So we're not talking about specific cases where that's happening. There's a scale to it. And we have observed this in the past, but never on this scale, for sure.
40 is a big number.
Yes. So it is quite fascinating. Out of the 4 case studies that we looked at, all of them are a little bit tied into one another, and that was with the purpose of bringing them to light. Specifically looking at Malaysia in one of these cases as a transshipment hub for cargo operations, we can see through trade data how there's been a monumental shift in reported imports and exports, both from Malaysia but also from China customs for crude oil. And within that bilateral trade, there's a discrepancy between what we see exported out of Malaysia to China mainland and what's imported from mainland China to Malaysia. But those levels also correlate to the number of STS and vessels seen operating off the Malaysian coast. So it starts to paint a picture that there's been this massive shift of vessels operating in this area, while at the same time, associated trade seems to match that pace. When we then start to look at the vessels operating in that specific area, we can see some of these supposed zombie vessels coming to light. So these are vessels which have adopted the identity of vessels which have been demolished and recycled historically, in some cases more than 5 years ago. And it's incredibly convincing. They've emulated the name, the IMO number, the dimensions, the MMSI, the call sign, which will tie them to a specific flag, and will transmit on those identifiers while carrying out whatever operations they are conducting, which makes it harder to then tie to the actual legitimate vessel that's transmitting those signals in the first place.
Discussing it in more detail like that really illustrates for our listeners the complexities involved in these deceptive shipping practices for sure. And I will mention for our listeners that I will include a link to the report in the description of the episode. And I'll also include a link to our blog on fraudulent flags. You mentioned false flags. Jeremy will give our listeners more information on that if they want to explore. So, given all that we've been discussing, Jeremy, what would you say are the main challenges that regulatory bodies face in identifying and addressing deceptive shipping practices?
I think some of the main challenges being experienced here is how convincing some of these methods can be and some of the tactics being utilized. The ultimate aim is to deceive, and in order to deceive, you have to look as convincing as possible. It is, as I said before, it's a magician's trick. You go to see a magician on stage and you're left wondering, how did they do it? And in some of these cases, without context, it's very difficult to say, yes, this is a complete make-believe, because they've invested a lot of time and effort to make it look as convincing as possible. And it's not always perfect, but it's knowing where to look and how to interpret it. And that's expertise that you acquire as opposed to information you can pick up at the drop of a hat. So I think that's one part of the challenge it's being faced. It's just how convincing some of this is, but actually gathering the data, validating it, is also quite challenging. It's something that we've developed a specialism over the years through the functions that we hold, but actually creating a reference sheet that you can trust and you can act against is quite important nowadays, because bad actors will provide you with documentations under the assumption that you won't necessarily question it or that you won't fault it. But when you compare it to other similar type of documentations, that's when some of those discrepancies can come to light. As an example, this morning, I was reviewing two flag certificates, supposedly from the same flag states. And between the two, there were discrepancies in terms of some of the layouts, some of the naming used for some of the fields. But had I not had one to compare it against, it would have been very difficult in that case to actually say that this was false in the first place. Developing that expertise, but also having that reference base of validated data and intelligence is also quite critical. And it's dynamic. This is constantly changing, as I said, finding new innovative ways to try and circumvent sanctions through deception.
Yeah. Yeah. If there was one takeaway I think we could all have from this discussion, it's complex and creative. But I don't want to put words in your mouth, Jeremy. It is time for us to wrap up our discussion. And I was going to ask you what you would say are the top takeaways for our listeners, or any final thoughts that you might have.
It's being vigilant. I think we're living in a time now where, from a maritime perspective, it is critical to have robust intelligence and validated intelligence to work against. So I think the key takeaway is to be vigilant wherever possible.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for taking the time to speak with us about the Maritime State of Play report, which is available. Like I said, I will include a link in the description. Until next time.
Thank you very much, Kristen.
Thank you for listening to the Decisive podcast from S&P Global. Please subscribe and join us for next week's episode. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.